This summer, the Hochul administration announced the first round of regulatory reforms as part of a concentrated effort to make state government more efficient and improve New Yorkers' interactions with state agencies. There were 50 actions taken at nearly 24 state agencies, and more actions have been pledged, including possibly addressing thousands of concerns flagged by the public. To help suss out redundant or unnecessary red tape, the governor has also utilized analysis from artificial intelligence. For more on this changing landscape, we're joined in the Capitol Press Room studio by Zoe Jacobs, Director of Regulatory Reform and Delivery in the governor's office. Welcome back to the show, Zoe.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So back in October, state agencies were asked to recommend rules or regulations that needed a refreshing or could be eliminated. From that list, the Hochul administration announced 50 actions in June. What do you think are some of the more substantive, wide-reaching changes that are happening as part of this first round of action?
Yeah, so just to set the stage a little bit, like you said, in October, the governor called on all state agencies to identify opportunities to save New Yorkers time and money. We announced the first 50 of those actions across about 22 state agencies. And I think I said this when we last spoke, but we have a few core focus areas. So housing is obviously a huge area of focus for the governor, and we're really excited and proud of the reforms that she was able to pass with Seeker, but there's so much more opportunity for us to advance reforms to make it faster and more affordable to build housing across the state. And there were two actions in particular as part of those 50 that I think are going to be quite impactful in the housing space that I'll talk about. First is we actually found a regulation on the books at Department of Transportation, which you typically wouldn't think of as the agency having to do much with housing, that was requiring people moving prefabricated homes. So those are modular homes, manufactured housing that we're really focused on trying to make cheaper and more widespread across the state. And it was actually requiring people moving those on state roads to spend $25,000 in bonding fees to be able to move those manufactured homes. And that's something that really was standing in the way of being able to get those homes affordably across the state. And that's something that we got rid of. We realized we didn't need to be imposing that hurdle. Another one in the housing space that we're quite excited about is we worked with Parks, who does state historic preservation reviews. They got to an agreement with HCR, housing agency, to be able to limit the number of housing projects that were going through state historic preservation reviews. They actually found that a lot of affordable housing projects that are being funded by HCR were unnecessarily being put through this process of having to review whether it was impacting a historic district. And so now we're limiting those reviews only to housing projects that are actually in historic districts, because why do you need to go through that, lengthy process if you're actually somewhere that is quite far from a historic district? So those are two examples in the housing space. Just a few more to rattle off.
Sure.
We have a whole set of actions that we were really excited about, making it easier for New Yorkers and people who are providing healthcare across the state to do that more efficiently and to reduce paperwork and unnecessary barriers. We actually had our Department of Health put forward a whole suite of regulations that removed the need for wet signatures from patients and providers, that removed the amount of paperwork and allowed people to submit things online, which actually wasn't possible because our regulations were specifically saying that things needed to be submitted in paper and that people need to sign things on paper. And so now we're actually giving healthcare providers across the state the ability to have electronic forms and electronic signatures in a way that wasn't possible before. And then another example of that is our regulations actually made it very difficult for healthcare providers and nursing homes to be able to do telehealth, because we had no, back when these regulations, when they were written, there was no such thing as telehealth. And so they were referencing a lot of in-person healthcare and in-person doctor appointments that were making it very challenging for nursing homes in the state to be able to advance telehealth appointments, especially in more rural areas where this is actually quite helpful in getting rural older adults access to specialists. And so now we actually changed the regulations to allow that to happen. So those are just a few examples, and happy to share more.
Well, let's stick with the healthcare side of things, because one of the changes that caught my eye has to do with relaxing the training hours required for certified nursing aides, essentially rolling it back to the federal minimum of 75 hours as opposed to the state's 100-hour requirement. We spoke with some advocates in the long-term care space who say, we don't understand why you'd want to lower the threshold for training. So what sort of evidence-based research or findings were there that led the state to say, yeah, we think we can still deliver a high quality of care, reducing the training hours by a quarter?
Yeah. So, our Department of Health also met with a lot of people in this space, and we're finding that actually a lot of them were already trying to do 75-hour trainings, and a lot of these providers that work in multiple states, I believe, were telling them that they're able to perform the same quality of care in these other states, and that this barrier was actually creating different curriculum that they had to do in New York State, and that was creating complications, and that they were able to actually perform just as well with the 75-hour requirements. And so it was really meeting the current practices that they're seeing in other states. And we have a nursing shortage in this state, and we need to be able to train nurses more efficiently and faster. And so this is really helping us balance those two needs, and we think that we're able to get the necessary training in the 75 hours.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. I'm David Lombardo, and we're speaking with Zoe Jacobs, Director of Regulatory Reform and Delivery in Governor Kathy Hochul's office. And what about the approach to fees? Because I know there's the elimination of fees for so-called commercial measuring devices and ending a $25 application fee for leashed tracking dog licenses. At the same time, I didn't see any action on some of the ones that we've heard people complain about, like funeral directors who pay for a digital system of reporting deaths that was set up and funded years ago, so their fees are just going to the general fund now. So how did you come up with the fees that you felt were outdated and could be eliminated, and how did you decide which ones you want to leave on the table, either to address in the future or not to address?
Yeah, great question. So these were just the first set of actions. These were just things that the agencies themselves looked at their books and balance sheets and said, you know what? We actually aren't generating a whole bunch of revenue through these fees, and they're imposing a necessary burden on whether it be small businesses or New Yorkers or people upstate that are trying to, go hiking and bring their dogs when they're hunting. And we don't think these are necessary anymore. But I know, the governor knows that there's a whole bunch more opportunity. And that's why she actually, as part of her regulatory reset, which I'm happy to go into, which was our next announcement, she actually directed every agency to do an audit of all the fines and fees on their books and do that same exercise in a more systematic way, because we know there's just a whole bunch more opportunity to, take a look at the fees and fines that we impose and try to see whether we actually need to still have all of these on the books.
And when it comes to reducing or eliminating a fine and fee, is that something where you guys are going to have a broader latitude than, say, going the other direction and trying to increase fines and fees? Or are statutes written in a way that it says like up to or may charge, or is this shall language? I mean, how are you approaching this, and how are your hands tied to some degree, if at all, by statute?
It really depends on the part of our code. Okay. There's some parts where in the statute, it actually says, you must impose this fee and it must be at least X dollar amount. But there are lots of places in our code, as we've dug into this, where basically the statute requires that there is a fee or authorizes an agency to impose a fee, but doesn't specify the dollar amount. And that's where we have quite a bit of latitude to actually say, what's the fee that makes sense in the current economic climate that we're in, which is one where affordability is the number one top concern for New Yorkers right now. And so we need to be really taking upon ourselves to find any opportunity to lower costs for New Yorkers, especially lower income New Yorkers.
Well, this then flies in the face of what you're talking about with regards to lowering costs, but I think about this as a modernizing effort as well. And so there are some fines and fees that were set 30, 40 years ago and have been static in the ensuing time. So is there any appetite as part of this effort to maybe update some fines and fees, and then you could potentially offset some of the ones that you also want to eliminate too?
Yeah. Absolutely. So we're really focused on lowering fines and fees for, New Yorkers that are struggling right now, and for small businesses that are struggling. Those are the targets of the ones that we want to lower, is things that help small businesses and help lower income New Yorkers. And then to your point, yes, there are absolutely fines and fees on the books for, really big companies or people who can afford to be paying these fees that probably we should look at and see whether there are opportunities for us to be generating more revenue. So I think it really depends on who's being impacted by the fee.
Now that you've got this first tranche of actions, how, if at all, do you review their impact to assess whether this was the right decision to eliminate X fee, to add additional ways to fill paperwork? I mean, is that part of your mandate, or are we like a hit and run where we, change the rules and regulations and just move on to the next thing?
No, it's a really good question. I mean, I see the outcome metrics for the work that we're doing as like hour saved, dollar saved, services provided.
And those are things you guys are tracking
And
now.
so, yeah, I think as we're going through, we're trying every reform that we are trying to put forward, we're doing a little bit of an analysis of how many hours and dollars do we think this is going to save? How much can this increase access to this service or help us build more units of housing? And then I think part of the work that we're going to be doing in the coming years is try to see what data is available to actually see whether these are having impact. Like, we're going to be looking this year to see for our seeker reforms, how many more units of housing are we able to build? What is the average cost of building a unit, and how is that being impacted because of the reforms that are actually actively impacting housing today?
Is that something that could then manifest itself in like an online dashboard so the public could keep tabs on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that we're thinking about. We want to have a centralized place where the average New Yorker can see, I submitted a concern to the governor. She's actually listening to us. We're moving on it. And I would love us to have a place where we can start tracking our wins.
And after a quick break, we'll continue our conversation with Zoe Jacobs, Director of Regulatory Reform and Delivery in the Governor's Office, which is looking to cut red tape and improve New Yorkers' interactions with state government. In June, they announced that they had identified 50 rules or regulations that could either be modified or completely eliminated at nearly 24 state agencies. When we get back, we'll talk about how artificial intelligence has aided this process and also consider some of the more challenging political regulations and rules that Governor Kathy Hochul may try to tackle in 2027. Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're continuing our conversation with Zoe Jacobs, Director of Regulatory Reform and Delivery in the Governor's Office, which is tasked with cutting red tape here in New York. The governor has said that every aspect of state government has gone through a quote-unquote AI grinder. And when we talked in March, you stressed that AI analysis would also be reviewed by humans. So how has this dynamic played out? Where have you been able to utilize AI analysis in a meaningful way to date?
Yeah. So just taking a bit of a step back,
Sure.
I think in March, it was right after or right in the midst of us collecting input from the public. And we actually received 4,000 recommendations from New Yorkers in every county in just 2.5 months.
Did you get to mine yet?
I'm sure we have. Actually, I could ask my team right after this to find
Sounds great.
But yeah, so through that, there were a lot of common themes that kept coming up. We kept hearing from people that they're having to fax things, that they're having to mail things, that they're finding that there are fees and fines on the books that make no sense, that there's all this mandatory reporting that's taking tons of time that no one's actually looking at. And through that, rather than just whack-a-mole all the individual things, we said, you know what? There's opportunity for us to do a much broader look within these common themes. And now, because of artificial intelligence, we have tools to be able to do this in a way that would have never been possible before. So what we did is we worked with some external partners. Stanford Reg Lab out of Stanford University, and Recoding America Fund, which is a group of former government technologists who have come together. And we worked with them to use AI-enabled tools to ingest our entire regulatory and statutory code. So over 18 million words of legal text, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of actual statutes and regs. And they took those, and then what they did is they developed these lists by agency within the 4 key areas that we were interested in. So outdated regulations, fees and fines, all mandated reports that our agency staff are spending time on, and all boards, commissions, and councils. And then what we've done is we've sent these lists to our agencies, and we're asking them to review them and actually take a look and see whether they think that these are opportunities for reform. And, the AI isn't going to be perfect. There are going to be mistakes. And so there's certainly going to be areas where they're going to say, you know what, this is actually really important. We can't touch this. Or you're right. This is an opportunity for reform and we should change this. And then we actually are also asking them to surface additional ideas that we might have missed. So that's kind of the work that the governor launched a couple weeks ago with her regulatory reset executive order.
How do you prepare AI to go through something like this? I'm not necessarily saying to get into the weeds on it, but how do you tell it what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what might be redundant? Because if you're going through statute, if you're going through rules and regulations for the first time and you don't have a background here, I mean, it could read like a foreign language to you, I imagine.
Yeah, no, and I think that's why it's been so helpful to work with these external experts that are all lawyers, that are all government people, and actually have created these models that they understand this text, and then they're finding examples, and then they're asking the AI to find, like, for instance, we found an example of a regulation requiring by telegraph or telephone that you notify DOT if there's a serious accident. And we basically said, we found this example. Please find all other examples in New York State's regulations that reference telegraphs. Or we found another one that was like, we had a regulation that was requiring charitable bingo license amendments to have 3 printed copies of that amendment. And we're like, please find all the other examples where we're asking people to submit multiple printed copies. So it's kind of like you find examples and then you work with the model to find many, many more examples of that. So for instance, on the fines and fees, we found like 50 examples of fines and fees in a regulation. We said, can you please pull all of the fines and fees for this agency?
So conversely, though, are you finding reports that might have needed to be done on an annual basis, or political appointments that need to get done that haven't been done? And are you passing out sticky notes to your colleagues? Hey, FYI, maybe this fell by the wayside. AI says, we need to fill out this after-school report or something like that.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, so one of the 4 areas that the governor asked agencies to look at as part of this regulatory reset was mandatory reports. And it's an astounding amount of mandatory reports that our agencies are being asked to write. And I am sure that there are many of these that have fallen by the wayside that actually we might find some of them are quite important and we want to really revamp this report. But I also know that there are many, many, many of them that are, a waste of agency staff time that could be put much to better use with other things that New Yorkers care far more about.
What about childcare? That was something you and I talked about in March as one of those areas where you're kind of having to balance competing interests, because you have to understand maybe a rule and regulation that seems pointless to someone else exists for a reason. So while childcare, I didn't see it as part of that first round of announcements in June, is there something that you're looking at in this space for possibly the future? Yeah,
no, certainly. We actually sat down this spring with, I think it was like almost 100 childcare providers. We did regional meetings. We did meetings with home-based care and bigger care centers. We met with school districts that are actually doing universal pre-K and childcare. And we heard from them around what were some of the biggest regulatory hurdles that were getting in their way. And we're in the midst of actually working through a package, hopefully, of things that we can do in this space. We're looking at ways that we can try to make the background check processes more streamlined, because there's different background checks for SCD license site and OCFS license sites. And we're trying to see whether there are things we can do in that space. We're looking at some of the facility requirements that we have on the books. We're looking at some of the worker qualifications. So there's a whole lot of things that came up, and some of them, to your point, have real trade-offs that are going to take us longer for us to work through the system, and that actually likely will require statutory change. But there are some quicker wins that we're trying to move on soon.
Another thing you made the case for in March is that this Governor Hochul, is willing to take on some challenges politically to update rules and regulations to cut that red tape. And to her credit, she went after the environmental quality review process in the budget to speed up housing. But when you think about what might get done in the future when it comes to probably statutory changes, are those things that are probably going to be rolled out in the context of a budget announcement, state of the state priorities, or are those going to be the rolling announcements that we see from this ongoing review?
Yeah, anything that will require statutory change will very likely go through the budget process next year.
Do you have anything kicking around right now?
I mean, I don't think it's any surprise, but we're going to try to take a swing at more things in the housing space. I can't really share the specifics right now, but we are absolutely looking at what else can help lower the cost and make it faster to build housing in the state of New York. And so we're taking a look there. We're also trying to see in small businesses. We really spent a lot of time this spring talking to small business owners, and we're doing a little bit of a process mapping of all the different touch points that a small business has with the state government and trying to see whether there are ways that we can kind of streamline that, make that process a lot more centralized, and things that we can do without changing the law, we are moving on. So for instance, in the small business space, we recently announced that we've removed 2/3 of the questions that we ask people when they're filling out our occupational licenses. We just deleted those from the form because we found we don't actually need to be asking these questions. And we're going to try to make it a whole lot faster for people to renew their occupational licenses, whether they're barbers or cosmetologists or security guards. We're actually going to be hopefully rolling out a new digital process for people to be renewing those.
Well, lastly, what does your average day look like? Because you're touching so many different aspects of state government, reporting back to the governor, spending time with influential radio hosts. So what does a day look like in the life of Zoe Jacobs?
You know, this is what makes the job so fun. Like every week's a little bit different. I would say what is really a big focus of mine is to make sure I'm spending a good chunk of my week every week talking to real people that are dealing with our bureaucracy, because I actually find that's where the best ideas are coming from. And it also helps us make sense of like the noise, is really to focus on like the very real stories that we're hearing from people. The second thing is, in addition to kind of the broad process work that I'm doing around, the regulatory reset, and I didn't really get to talk about this, but we're also doing a whole set of work around permitting and trying to see, we're working with all our agencies to do a bit of like a tear down and audit of our permitting processes and find efficiencies. So in addition to kind of that broad work, every week I want to make sure that we're moving the ball on like the governor's key policy priorities, whether that be housing, small businesses, childcare, making healthcare and access to services more efficient. So it's the broad work, but then also the deeper focused policy work.
Well, we've been speaking with Zoe Jacobs. She's the Director of Regulatory Reform and Delivery in Governor Kathy Hochul's office. Zoe, thanks for visiting us in the studio.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.